So the third stage of the info processing model is going to be retrieval. And when we talk about retrieval, there are actually two different ways that we can get information back out of our memory system. They're called recall and then recognition. So first we'll start with what recall is. Definition is the retrieval of information that you've learned earlier, such as on like a fill-in-the-blank test. Recall asks you to actively go into your memory system and, without much prompting, be able to pull information out. We'll do an example of a recall task. At this point, you've learned who Herman Ebbinghaus is, so what I want you to do is try to just think about who was Ebbinghaus and why was he important for memory. So take a second, maybe pause it, give yourself a chance to try to recall that, and then we'll go over the answer, which is that Ebbinghaus is known for coming up with his retention curve. He also did some work on forgetting, which we'll get to in a little bit. He made himself lists of nonsense syllables, and he studied them varying lengths of time on day one to see, how well would he recall it later on. And he found that as rehearsal time increases, relearning time decreases, which is a negative correlation. So that's an example of a recall task because you're responsible for filling in all the information by just going into your memory and really using all of your memory ability to pull that information out without many hints. Now, the other type of retrieval task tends to be a little bit easier. This is called recognition. And this is when all you have to do is identify items that you've previously learned. Closest correlate I can find from a school setting would be something like a multiple choice test, or maybe a fill in the blank with a word bank as opposed to not. So we'll do an example of a recognition task. In this multiple choice question, you have to identify what type of long-term memory this example pertains to. So your memory of celebrating your last birthday is an example of which type of LTM? A, episodic, B, semantic, C, procedural, or D, implicit. Hopefully this one is pretty easy. That's going to be an episodic memory. And not only should have been easy because you should know that, but also should have been easier because recognition tasks generally are easier than recall tasks because you're given many more hints to go on. And the research supports what oftentimes you just feel yourself, which is that recognition tasks tend to be easier and recognition type of information tends to hang around longer. A lot of times over time, what we're going to see happening is your recall is going to fade away, but recognition is going to maintain itself. A research study which has supported this finding was performed by psychologist Harry Borick, and what he did was he studied people's memory of their high school classmates. And I know right now you might think you're going to remember your high school classmates forever, or maybe you don't think so, but he wanted to see how memory for the people we go to high school with lasts 25 years down the line. And so let's imagine, he shows up at a 25-year reunion, and what he did was he tested people's memory in two ways, one of which was a recall task and one of which was a recognition. So the recall task, he had people just try to write out a list of people they went to high school with. No help given, just here's a pen, here's paper, and just try to remember as many as you can. And the second type of task was people were given a list of names. Some of the names were their classmates and some of the names were just distractors, or they were given a Facebook of sorts with photos of their classmates mixed in with photos of just random people. And what he found was that the recall task did not go well. People did really, really poorly at recalling their high school classmates. However, people's recognition was very, very good. They were at about 90% success rate at that. So this is just one of the many findings which supports this idea that recognition tends to be a lot easier than recall. If you want to try it yourself, you can attempt to write down all of the names of all of the 7 dwarfs from Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Give yourself a second, pause this if you have to. And so this would be testing your recall of that information, which I imagine is not that great. And then to test maybe more so on the recognition side, if I gave you this list right here, obviously the 7 dwarfs are scattered in there as well as some other people. And so my assumption is if you took a second and paused this and tried to pick out all of the 7 doors from this list, you'd be pretty good. Now, if you just want to check your work against your list, or that you came up with recall, or just the ones you recognize out of the previous list, you have sneezy, sleepy, happy, grumpy, dopey, doc, and bashful. Now, one of the reasons why recognition tends to be a much easier job than recall has everything to do with the way that memory works, which is that we store memories not just for the information they contain, but also for everything that's happening surrounding our acquisition of the memory. And so retrieval cues are going to be things which can help trigger memory. They're sort of access points to an existing memory. And so the more retrieval cues you're given, the more opportunities you're given to really get at where a memory lives. So this is important to remember when you're forming a memory in the first place. You can learn information in a couple of different ways. And if you only learn information one way and you only approach information from like one perspective and like one study method, you're going to end up building yourself information that only has maybe like one retrieval cue. That's sort of like locking that memory up inside a submarine. There's only one way to get back to that information. And if you can't find that one specific access point, you're going to be in trouble. So you kind of want to build your memory like information inside of a cruise ship. You look at this cruise ship and there's all sorts of different ways to get inside that cruise ship. So when you're learning something, try to learn it in all sorts of different manners. Build yourself lots of different pathways to the information because then the more retrieval cues you have, the better the odds are you're going to be able to at least access one of them to get at the memory. There are a couple of specific terms that talk about retrieval cues, one of which is going to speak to context-dependent memory, or the effect of context on our ability to better recall information. When we encode a memory, we also encode the context within which we acquired that memory. And research has supported the idea that if you put yourself back in the same context, so sort of like the same environment of learning, that can actually help your recall. One such study was performed by Godin and Badley, and what they did was they had somewhat of a small sample size of scuba divers that learned lists of words either underwater or on the beach. And then they were asked to recall that list of words either underwater or on the beach. And so you had some people who learned the list underwater and were asked to recall the list underwater. You had other people who learned the list underwater but were asked to recall the list whilst on land, and vice versa. And ultimately what they found was that recall was best when the context of learning was mirrored in the context of recall. So the individuals who studied the list underwater did way better when they were asked to recall it whilst underwater again, and the people who studied the list on land did best when they were able to recall the list on land again. So there might be some truth to the idea that you might perform a little bit better on exams or assessments if you're taking them within your same classroom as when you learned the information. Maybe just from personal life, if you've ever lost something, if you go back and you like retrace your steps, it can help trigger your memory for where you left it in the first place. It's the theory behind why police take witnesses back to the scene of a crime. They're hoping it will jog their memory. I will say that's a little problematic. Our memory is really, really, really fallible, and it's very suggestible. And so oftentimes by putting someone back in the same context of where they witnessed a crime, they actually end up incorporating misleading information and forming a newly flawed memory of what happened to them in the first place. Maybe a couple of other examples for you from just like day-to-day life. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you go home after a day of school and you go through your mental checklist and you think, okay, like I didn't have any homework for my psychology class, or whatever class you want to pick. And then you show back up at school and you're thinking, no homework, no homework, no homework. You walk into the room, and the second you walk back into the classroom, you think, oh my goodness, my teacher did assign a homework assignment. Like, how did I not remember until now? Well, that room served as the context clue for you. If you are ever You think of something you want to go look up. So you get onto your laptop, you start going to Google, and you think, why on earth am I sitting here? Like, I don't remember what I was going to look up. So then you do whatever you're going to do online and you leave. And the second you go back to what you were doing prior, that's when it hits you. You're doing homework up in your class, up in your bedroom. You go down to the kitchen because you remember you have to pick something up, like from the kitchen. You step into the kitchen and you think, why am I here? I know I had something I wanted to do, but I cannot for the life of me remember why I'm standing here. You go back upstairs to your bedroom. The second you enter your bedroom, it hits you again. So in all of these examples, your environment is serving as that retrieval cue. Like your environment can serve as a retrieval cue, which is like an external cue. Our internal physiological or emotional state can also serve as a retrieval cue. There's something called state-dependent memory, which is defined as this phenomenon where what we learn in a certain physiological, like biological bodily state, can oftentimes be more easily recalled when we're in that state again. One example, information you acquire while slightly caffeinated, you'll have a tendency to recall best when you're again slightly caffeinated in the future. There's a lot of research that looks into this with different types of medications. Morphine would be one of them. There's some research that tries to look at this in terms of people who are over 21 and being in states of intoxication, although we should be careful with that because we also do know that at a certain point, if you are too heavily intoxicated, your memory stops being able to encode or to store any new information whatsoever. And so with state-dependent memory, we also have a very specific type, which refers more to our emotional state more than anything else. And that's known as mood congruent memory. This is our tendency to recall experiences that are consistent with your current good or bad mood. Pretty much, if you're in a positive mood, the types of memories that you're going to more easily trigger are the positive ones. Because when you experience something positive in your life and you're storing that memory, you're also storing your current mood as a retrieval cue. So when you put yourself back in that mood again, those types of memories are more easily going to come to the surface. Also works in the opposite direction with negative memories. When you're in a bad mood, I don't know if you ever noticed, it seems like nothing can go your way. No matter what you do, you always just seem to focus on the bad, and everything just seems to be triggering really, really upsetting memories. That's because of mood congruent memory. And this also leads into some research on the idea that cognitively, one of the reasons why depression seems to work cyclically and is such a vicious cycle is because of mood congruency. That an individual who is currently depressed, they have this tendency to think about depressing memories. Thinking on and ruminating on depressing memories makes you more likely to become more depressed, and that makes you think of even more depressing memories, and it just kind of snowballs. There's some research that has looked into this and has looked at individuals who are currently depressed versus formerly depressed, and what they find is that their recall for memory is drastically different. So this is just a suggestion of one little cognitive component for depression.